Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And a special welcome to the new fellows and college members who were inducted yesterday into the Academy of the Arts and Humanities and the College of the Royal Society of Canada. We are delighted and we are honored that you are joining us. I am Irving Abella. I'm the president of the Academy of the Arts and Humanities, and I will serve as your ringmaster, master of ceremonies for this afternoon's festivities. On behalf of the fellowship, I would like to thank the University of Victoria for their generous support as the presenting supporter and sponsor of this annual general meeting. What we will do today is feature presentations by 7 of our new fellows and college members representing disciplines under the humanities and arts umbrella, and we're delighted to do that. Now, this is a complicated part. Each talk will be accompanied by a presentation of 20 slides, which will somehow, and I don't know how, advance themselves every 20 seconds. So you can set your clocks for a total time of 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Okay? That I'm sure it'll work fine. So, but don't blame me if it doesn't. I would ask you to keep your questions until a period of open discussion that will follow the last presentation, because we don't want any interruptions. And throughout the afternoon, I've been asked to encourage you to share the conversation on social media by using the hashtag HEAGM. So before we hear our new fellows, I'd like to invite Susan Lewis, Dean of the Fine Arts of the University of Victoria, to bring words of special greeting on behalf of this weekend's presenting sponsor. Susan?
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished academics, artists, and guests. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Apollo Café. Today we have the opportunity to learn more about the research and creative practice of artists and scholars in the arts and humanities, one of the core streams of learning and research celebrated by the Royal Society. The position of the arts and humanities in Canada's National Academy signals the vital and dynamic role they play in our country. The arts and humanities are where intellectual, artistic, and social thought intersect. They provide opportunities for innovation, creativity, and social engagement that have a lasting and meaningful impact across the country and abroad. Today's series of short presentations by new fellows and college members from across the country represent the highest level of academic and artistic excellence in the arts and humanities. It's also my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University of Victoria. UVic is recognized nationally and internationally as a research-intensive university with leadership in many spheres of critical research and creative endeavor. Our 20,000 students study in a research-enriched environment integrated with hands-on experiences that support personal growth and career success. For UVic students, education happens in the classroom, in the studio, across campus, around town, and around the world. This year, arts students studied theater in India, exhibited works at local galleries, sang in cathedrals in England, presented research on digital scholarship, and met real-world deadlines in professional writing programs. As you've seen, UVic is situated on Canada's extraordinary west coast in a vibrant Pacific Rim community, rich with Indigenous and international perspectives. It is an environment that encourages discovery, innovation, and creativity. And these are all ingredients that make Victoria, BC's capital, a city rich in cultural heritage and achievement, and a fitting location to induct 84 new fellows into the Royal Society and celebrate the cohort of the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. I also have the pleasure of introducing our first three speakers. I would now like to invite our first speaker of this morning's program, Dániel Peter Biró, from the School of Music at the University of Victoria. Dániel Biró is Associate Professor of Composition and Music Theory at the University of Victoria. He received his PhD from Princeton University in 2004. In 2011, he was visiting professor at Utrecht University, and in 2014-2015, fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. His compositions are performed around the world, and he is internationally active as a composer, researcher, performer, lecturer, and teacher. Professor Biró's presentation is titled Music Composition as Research of History and Memory.
Thank you, Susan. My talk will investigate my compositional research and research of history and memory, and how the field of ethnomusicology has affected my compositional language and methodology. So I'll be showing you some pictures of Budapest, a city where I grew up, to introduce how one might listen to a piece of music. We see on top Budapest in 1900. Underneath, we see the city in the year 2000. I ask about how these images, with all the historical changes they imply, might relate to a piece of music. In listening to a piece of music, we listen to various layers of history. Much like this city that was once part of a monarchy, lived through fascism, communism, and countless revolutions, a piece of music can also embed material from various historical epochs. A composer deals with creating new musical material. The research component lies in creative, innovative material and forms. Simultaneously, composition can be a way to investigate the past and carry it forward into the future. Several of my compositions seek to investigate materials like this city. My string quartet stands in dialogue with the quartet of Franz Schubert from 1826. Schubert's work exists as a ghost in my own work, much like a ruin in a transformed modern city. I've been researching also traditions of Hungarian laments, Jewish Torah recitation, Christian plain chant, and Islamic Quran recitation. This research has affected the way I compose and how I perceive what music is, where it comes from, and where it might go. In the next slide, you will see the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. You will hear an example of Jewish Torah recitation from Iraq and Italy. Through melody, the given congregation understands the sign indicated in red that the sentence has ended. First from Iraq. End of sentence. Now from Italy. End of sentence. This has its correlation in early plain chant, where a system of notation was developed to ensure the correct pronunciation of the sacred word. We hear how the following Romanian letter indicates an accentuation of the word terribilis, or awesome, L indicating levare, or lift the neum. Here. I also studied practices of Quran recitation in the Netherlands, in mosques where Indonesian women were the main teachers of recitation. even to Turkish boys. We hear how pronunciation is structured in the recitation of renowned Indonesian reciter Maria Ulfa.
Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ.
In 2013, I went to Tunisia to make field recordings of Tunisian Torah and Quran recitation. These recordings were examined via computer, and the results of this research have also affected how I compose. This computational analysis of audio files is done to discover the melodic contour of a given performance. We can then compare these contours and the frequencies in and across cultural and religious chant traditions. This also has gone into my compositional work. For over 12 years, I've worked on an extended composition cycle entitled Mishpatim, or laws, employing Hebrew Bible text about various ritual, legal, and ethical laws. It integrates aspects of my ethnomusicological research into the composition. In this cycle, I employ resonant ghost instruments. These instruments are activated by computer, creating a dialogue between live instruments and resonant instruments, sounds of the present with echoes of the past. In this cycle, I've also integrated gematria, or Hebrew number symbolism. In Hebrew, each letter is assigned a corresponding numerical value. I employ gematria to structure musical parameters like rhythm, pitch, and how sound moves in space. This can be heard in my composition Hadavar, the word, part of the cycle. Here, numerical values of the Hebrew words structure pitch, rhythm, meter, singing techniques, and instrumental resonance. And you will hear this in the next slide. Gematria structuring can be heard in my piece for solo bass flute, Kivrot HaTa'ava, which represented Canada in the 2013 World Music Days in Vienna. This composition will be heard tonight at the gala and is an example of how I explore history and memory through music composition. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Professor Biró. Our next speaker is Una Delia from the Department of Art History at Queen's University. Una Delia is a leading scholar in the interpretation of Renaissance art. Her award-winning and critically acclaimed publications are lauded internationally for revealing new interpretations of the works of such famous artists as Titian, Michelangelo, and Raphael, by focusing on strange, monstrous, and ambiguous images in relation to a panoply of serious and satirical texts. In 2009, Delia was the recipient of a prestigious Villa Itati Fellowship. Her presentation title is Raphael's Ostrich.
Raphael painted this allegorical personification of justice in a reception room in the Vatican Palace. In one hand, she holds the traditional attribute, the scales. The fingers of the other hand, however, instead of brandishing the sword as in previous images of justice, curl around the neck of an alert, aggressive, and ugly ostrich. What is this African bird doing in the Vatican Palace? To answer this question, we must go back to ancient Egypt. The ostrich feather was the hieroglyph for justice, because the ostrich feather, something very light, was weighed against the heart of the deceased in a trial to see if the deceased could pass into the happy fields of the afterlife. The knowledge of the hieroglyphs was lost with the fall of ancient Egyptian civilization, but ostriches continue to figure in European culture. They were a part of Roman imperial spectacle, hunted in the Colosseum, and served up at lavish imperial banquets. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, and as well as in the early Renaissance, the ostrich was considered to be a hybrid, part bird, part four-footed beast. Indeed, still today, the scientific Latin name for ostrich is Struthio camelis, or sparrow camel. This living monster was used to signify a host of different qualities, some positive and some wholly negative. Here, the ostrich, staring at its egg and causing it to be born, is a symbol of the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. In other cases, the ostrich is a wholly negative symbol of turning away from God, sin, gluttony, etc. In this badly preserved fresco, the ostrich in the central foreground is one of the howling beasts of Babylon, the embodiment of the sins that led to Babylon's destruction. Ostriches continued to be depicted in the art and literature of the early Renaissance. And so in this case, the ostrich, which holds a delicate nail in its beak, is celebrated for its ability to eat iron, and so symbolizes the toughness of the duke whose palace this intarsia decorates. The ostrich could also be depicted without any moral or symbolism, as a monster, a marvel of nature. The ostrich had many meanings in antiquity and the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, but not justice until Raphael revived the ancient Egyptian association. In Renaissance Rome, intellectuals were fascinated with ancient Egypt, and they found a text which partially explained some of the hieroglyphs, including the ostrich feather signifying justice. This painting is labeled Justice, but Raphael made us search for an explanation of the ostrich's presence. He hid the ostrich's distinctive tail feathers and also hid another clue, a small diamond ring hanging from the fulcrum of Justice's scales. You can see the round form of the ring and the diamond pointing down. The diamond ring with 3 ostrich feathers is one of the personal emblems of the Pope who paid for this painting, Pope Leo X. And so the ostrich that accompanies justice carries multiple meanings, but we need to look closely. Raphael died soon after this painting of Justice with her ostrich was completed. He died in his 30s on Good Friday and was compared to Jesus and enshrined in this elaborate marble tomb in the Pantheon. Because he was deemed a god of art, others imitated his bizarre image. After Raphael, ostriches were depicted in Italian Renaissance paintings, sculptures, parade floats, prints, games of fortune, and even tableware. This tomb with an elegant marble Justice and her ostrich was made for an austere Dutch pope who would have absolutely hated this kind of enigmatic hieroglyphic imagery. Some sought to outdo Raphael in adding even further layers of complex erudite meaning. The artist, Giorgio Vasari, had to write a long letter explaining this almost ludicrously complex painting of Justice as Astrea with an ostrich under her arm to his learned patron, as otherwise the work would have been incomprehensible. Others overturned the association between the ostrich and justice. Here, the ostrich is a part of an image of the cruel and arbitrary nature of fortune. Fortune, who distributes goods and punishments randomly, is, of course, the antithesis of justice. And sometimes the ostrich is just an ostrich. Ostriches were kept in Italian zoos in this period, prized for their feathers and eggs, and admired as among the strangest of God's creations. This period saw, in addition to a flourishing of the arts, the beginnings of the modern study of natural history. Scientists studied ostriches and tried to understand their weird physiology and habits, struggling to explain the presence of feathers on a flightless bird, for example. It's easy to laugh at Renaissance views of animals, but our most common image of this creature is that of the ostrich which puts its head in the sand. Ostriches do not actually do this, but they do eat iron and do other strange things ascribed to them in the Renaissance. Now that science has been divorced from art and rhetoric, we are left today with this hollow caricature. Renaissance art, in contrast, forces us to look closer in order to understand how even the most bizarre aspects of the natural world were once imbued with scientific, moral, and poetic meaning.
Merci, Una. Our next speaker is Joan MacLeod from the Department of Writing at the University of Victoria. Joan MacLeod is one of Canada's foremost playwrights. Her works explore contemporary social justice issues with characters who are often on the margins of Canadian society. Traduites en 6 langues, ces pièces sont été interprétées partout au Canada et à l'étranger. She has received numerous awards, including the Governor-General's Award for Drama, 2 Chalmers Canada Play Awards, a Dora Award, and the Simonovich Prize. Professor MacLeod's talk is titled From Page to Stage.
Back one slide. No? We're missing the first slide. So can we wait 20 seconds for that? Or just hold that for another 20 seconds? The one you can't see is me in 1982 at the Banff Center in the Advanced Writers Studio, working with W.O. Mitchell and an editor on my unpublishable novel. I don't have a photo from a night 2 years later when I was back in Banff as a poet. An actor from the Playwrights Colony performed a poem I'd written. I was 30 years old. I'd been to the theater twice in my life. A light went on, sitting there in the audience, watching an actor bring my poem to life. My writing was stronger out loud. A year later, I wrote a short monologue that eventually became my first play, Jewel. Because I didn't know any better, and I certainly knew nothing about acting, I performed it myself. I was in Banff again, and my first audience, a group that was there for a conference on cud-chewing animals. Since that night, nearly 30 years ago now, I've written 12 plays, and I haven't, thankfully, been on a stage since Jewel. My novel had been written in the first person, my poetry as well, and from being a poet, I knew something about how to compress language. I think the particular way I write was designed for the stage. I just didn't know it until that snowy night in Banff. What becomes a play often begins in a personal way. My first multi-character play, Toronto, Mississippi, about a mentally handicapped girl, came out of my experience as a child care worker. Most of my plays take place within a family, the definition of family far-reaching, never traditional. I always begin by writing monologues, just to explore. Even for the multi-character plays, I create a character and trust that through that character's voice, I'll be able to get a sense of the world of the play, and at least the start of a plot. When I have enough to start a first draft, I do start at the beginning, but soon I write out of order, I write simply where I can. I usually know the ending when I'm about 2/3 of the way through. From first draft to sixth draft to opening night, the process usually takes a couple of years. Much of my work is rooted in issues around social justice and often is in response to current events. The AIDS crisis in the Hope Slide, the murder of Victoria teenager Rena Verk in The Shape of a Girl. My most recently produced play, The Valley, it's here in Victoria in February if you're around, is about an altercation between a teenager in the midst of a psychotic break on the SkyTrain and a Vancouver City police officer. Now, when I started, I thought The Valley was going to be about Robert Jakanski, the Polish man who died after being tasered in the Vancouver airport by 4 RCMP officers. But once I began researching, I became interested in how policing had changed throughout my lifetime and how often now policing includes dealing with those who struggle with mental illness. So there is something to writing, to the whole process, about remaining open as I go and keeping my ear to the ground. Every year, I still go to Banff to write. This past June, I finished the first draft of a new one-person show, Gracie. The character Gracie was born and raised in a fundamentalist Mormon polygamist community. The play begins when Gracie is 8 and moves with her mother and sisters from Colorado City, Arizona, to Bountiful in southeastern British Columbia for her mother's and sisters' weddings. Now, some of you who aren't from Victoria, you might not know this right now, but they're about to go to trial. 3 leaders from Bountiful finally are going to be facing charges around polygamy and the transport of child brides. I've always been fascinated by that community. It presently has a population of over 1,000. Primarily, they are the descendants of 7 men. The excerpt that you're going to hear was inspired by an article I read about Warren Jeffs, the so-called prophet, rapist, pedophile, who instructed his followers from prison when they were in Arizona to throw away their children's toys, and so they did. You're going to see a couple of slides that are just from the internet. I'm just using them to inspire myself as I write. So the character's name is Gracie, and I'm just going to finish by giving you a little bit about her. So she's 8. I used to have a bike, but one day God told someone we weren't allowed to ride our bikes no more. I had to take my old bike to the back of this warehouse and set it on a big pile of bikes. I don't know what happened to them bikes. Maybe they set them on fire. Maybe they gave them to kids in China. No one really knew for sure. The day we come to Canada, there was a brand new bike on the porch of our new house. I thought it belonged to the kids next door, but Mama said it's mine. The bike is purple with gold streamers. I keep the tag on it. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Canadian Tire. I love you, bike. I ride past the big barn and mill, past the motel house where our new daddy lives, then up and down the lanes past little houses just like ours, one after another. I stop when I get to the chain that crosses the road. I lean my bike against the post, walk to the other side of the chain. There's a big valley out front. I look it over, and there's a no trespassing sign that hangs from the chain. I go back around the sign, back to where I'm supposed to be. Every place I ever lived, I knew I was home when I seen that sign. Thank you.
Isn't technology wonderful? It worked, and scholarship was even better. Thank you. And merci, Joan. Nous prendrons maintenant une pause de 20 minutes. We will now take a 20-minute break to enjoy lunch, and then we will continue with our second series of speakers. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Schimmelpenninck van der Rohe, a professor in the Department of History at Brock University. He is, as I've learned, North America's leading historian of Russian international relations, which is some importance now. Travaillant à l'intersection de l'histoire diplomatique, intellectuelle, culturelle et militaire, il est mondialement renommé pour ses contributions novatrices à notre compréhension de la relation ambiguë de la Russie avec l'Asie au passé dans le présent. His extensive work in Russian, Central Asian, and European archives have yielded publications translated into Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, French, Dutch, Finnish, German, Russian, and a whole variety of other languages, I suspect. His presentation is entitled Russia's Great Game, The Struggle for Mastery in Central Asia. David?
For much of the 19th century, Russia and England waged a Cold War. Like the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US 100 years later, the Great Games adversaries competed not for each other's territory, but for hegemony over third parties. The Great Games playing field stretched from the ancient empire of Persia through Afghanistan, the immense inner Asian no man's lands that separated Russian Siberia from British India, to Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Tibet, then nominally under rule of the Qing dynasty. Despite the term's gentlemanly connotations, the Great Game was in fact a deadly serious struggle for mastery over the Asian heartland. Queen Victoria once said that the stakes of the Great Game were nothing less than a question of Russian or British supremacy in the world. Now, the rivals did fight on Crimea's battlefields during the 1850s, but the Great Game involved remarkably little direct armed conflict. In Central Asia, they conducted operations mostly against third parties to secure their allegiance, like Persia and Afghanistan, or to annex territories to pacify it. Both players used very similar tactics during the Great Game, but their goals were entirely different. British actions were largely guided by fears of Tsarist designs on India. Until 1907, the prime directive of London's policy was halting what appeared to be Russia's advance on the jewel of the British crown. Some Britons began to see Russia's drive into Central Asia much like America's domino theory. According to one viceroy of British India, Lord Curzon, in the absence of any physical obstacle, Russia was as much compelled to go forward as the Earth is around the sun. Now, Russia's motives are still the stuff of lively debate amongst historians. But because the relative archives were as inaccessible to foreigners in the 20th century as much of Central Asia was to Europeans in the 19th, it had long been virtually impossible properly to study Russia's involvement in the Great Game. Relatively freer access now to the sources provides a possibly temporary opportunity to examine why and how Russia carried out its Central Asian campaigns. As the first archival analysis by a non-Russian, my study will make a major contribution to our understanding of Russian international history. To understand Tsarist motives in Central Asia, I focus on the mentalité, motives, and mechanics of Russian conquest during the 19th century's third quarter. This was the time when Tsarist troops conquered Kokand, Khiva, and Bukhara, bringing them almost to India's frontier. The classic English account is still Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game. What makes the book such a great read is that it was not written by an academic historian, but by a journalist for the Times. Unfortunately, Hopkirk couldn't work in the Russian archives. The author of the standard Russian language work, Naftula Aronovich Halfin, was allowed to work in the Tsarist archives. But his book is hardly objective, as the title suggests the union of Central Asia to Russia, which implies that its conquest was largely voluntary and peaceful. The Soviet Union's fall did not necessarily lead to a more objective view of Russia's past. Rather than viewing the Great Game through the rose-colored lenses of the class struggle, today it is portrayed as a glorious feat of arms that vanquishes cruel Oriental Khans and Albion's perfidy in Asia. And so my research follows two parallel paths. The first is reading the correspondence, minutes, memoranda, and other documents written by the Romanov autocracy's decision-makers, and much of this is in archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Tashkent. Now, working in Russian archives still presents many challenges. This photo of the Foreign Ministry's archive for pre-revolutionary foreign policy is a good example. Here's the front. Aside from the porta potty, does anybody detect a door? In fact, it's in the back, around more cars parked to the side. If you look very carefully, you'll find a little buzzer. If you're allowed inside, you submit your passport to stone-faced policeman's scrutiny, and if your name happens to be on his list, he'll let you in. Now, understanding Tsarist activities in Central Asia involves not just the political, diplomatic, and military background, but also public opinion, orientology, geography, not to mention literature and the arts. Take the opera Prince Igor. Alexander Borodin composed it at the height of Russia's campaigns in the sands of Turkestan. And so my approach blends diplomatic with intellectual and cultural history. I examine both how decisions were made and their ideological and intellectual context. Now, Russia's Great Game holds considerable relevance to us today. Having regained independence from Moscow, the Central Asian republics, the so-called stands, have once again become the object of rivalry amongst the great powers. And of course, a better understanding of Tsarist foreign policy also yields valuable insights into today's Russian Federation. To answer the inevitable question granting agencies ask about the relevance of my research to contemporary Canadian policy, I'll conclude with the words of Senator Raoul Dandurand when he reassured us that in Canada we live in a fireproof house far from inflammable materials. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Erin Manning from the Department of Studio Arts and Film Studies at Concordia. Erin Manning holds a Concordia University Research Chair in Relational Art and Philosophy. Her art practice is centered on large-scale participatory installations that explore perception, sensation, and relation. Her books similarly explore the relationship between movement, sensation, and perception, with a growing focus on neurodiversity. She is the director of the Sense Lab, a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy with an explicit focus on research creation. Her presentation is entitled Weather Patterns, Art, and the More Than Human. Professor Manning.
This presentation will focus on two parallel practices, that of writing philosophy and that of creating collaborative participatory works. While these practices are radically different in their material explorations, they come together through their sustained interest in the politics of collaboration, the exploration of movement, and resituating the human in a larger ecology of experience. 4 books that foreground a theory of movement, perception, and the more than human frame this inquiry. I will begin with a brief description of this work, even as we move through slides of the artistic works that occurred in parallel to the writing. I will then discuss the artwork in more detail. In Politics of Touch, 2007, I begin an exploration of the place of movement in the discourse of the modern subject and the nation state, exploring the place of the senses in political theory and philosophy. Relationscapes 2009 deepens the analysis of movement through an exploration of its role in the early 20th century photography, cinema, and dance, and in indigenous art and cosmology. A theory of movement emerges that foregrounds not displacement across space, but the incipiency at the heart of experience itself. Led by process philosophy, the work asks how else we might conceive of the political were we to foreground the force of incipiency at the heart of creation. In Always More Than One, 2012, I shift toward the more than human, emphasizing that movement activates and courses through human bodies, but is not limited to them. Autism is key to this work, and particularly what I call autistic perception, an account of the way autistics perceive movement and transition over form. The work challenges the belief that relation always refers to human relations and asks what else the world could look like should we perceive it differently. The works you have been looking at are part of a series called Weather Patterns. Weather pattern, the movement of the sun on a terrace in the late afternoon, the smell of red in the fall, the weight of closed skies in a dark February winter, the moodiness of shadows on fresh snow, the light after the rain. In The Minor Gesture, 2016, I explore how weather patterns are minor gestures that open perception to an encounter with the ecologies of its surround. Like the works themselves, I ask how it might be possible to design an environment that makes felt minor shifts that affect how we live and participate in the world. Weather patterns entertaining the environment, the earlier slides you saw, attempt to create an environment that is not first and foremost affected or oriented by human bodies. This work affected the writing of The Minor Gesture, which includes a critique of what I call the agency, volition, intentionality triad at the heart of neurotypicality. What would a neurodiverse environment feel like? Weather Patterns, The Smell of Red, the work you're seeing now, is primarily composed of cinnamon, paprika, and cocoa. The cocoa and the paprika are backgrounded and used in much smaller quantities. The paprika slightly sharpens the smell of the cinnamon. The cocoa slightly softens it. The work includes 3 tornadoes that form their funnels only when the air is still. Bodies moving quickly through the space cannot perceive them. This tunes body movement in the space. Its proposition, continuing the work of entertaining the environment, how to create the conditions for a slow enough encounter with the environment that minor shifts in perception, in this case chiefly smell, can be experienced. In each case of the propositions of the weather patterns, of which there have been 5, and all of which are collaborative works, in each case, people are invited to respond to the work. In The Smell of Red, the response is to a garden. So they can water the tornadoes should the work be up for a while. They can sweep the sand and spices to create walking paths or constellations, in this case inspired by the Zen rock gardens. The proposition is that this emphasis on caring for the space affects, or perhaps affects, how people move through it, and by extension, perhaps alters their perception of it. In some cases, the work also activates synesthetic tendencies, hence the title, The Smell of Red. Work on relationscapes and minor gestures has taught me that when we foreground movement in its incipiency, perception is powerfully altered. The work is an homage to the complexity of perception experienced every day by autistics and other neurodivergent people. In Weather Patterns, where forces meet, I explore how forces in the environment attune to one another. The materials, conductive thread, metal filings, magnets, piano wire, form a kind of instrument of forces in continuous interplay. Most shifts in the environment are too slow to directly perceive, but the choreography of the thread does give a sense that minor gestures are active and activating. With fans and speakers connected to an algorithm that creates a self-organizing criticality, rhythms of change are produced. The participant is drawn, perhaps, to revisit the environment, to see how air currents modulate the work, to watch the metal filings move toward magnets, and to see how gravity ultimately overdetermines the minor forces at work. The hope, participants will feel themselves collaborating with the less perceptible of the environmental forces. My writing and my artistic process are also deeply aligned to a commitment to local politics, community projects, and activism in the context of social justice. This occurs primarily within the environment of the Sense Lab, a laboratory for thought and movement I started in 2004 that explores collectively how concepts such as minor gestures can affect the way we compose experience across populations, both human and more than human. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manning. Our next speaker is David Wilson from the Department of History and the Celtic Studies program at the University of Toronto. He is internationally recognized for his work on the Atlantic Revolution and for his award-winning books on the Irish in 19th century Canada, books that I've used in my course on immigration at York for years. Il explore les thèmes reliés aux idéologies révolutionnaires et conservatrices, à la religion et au nationalisme, ainsi que les tensions entre la sécurité de l'État et la liberté civile. Throughout his career and as general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, he has sought to bring historical research to the widest possible audience and has succeeded. David's presentation is called Memoirs. Mentors. Well, they got it right here and wrong here. Thank you.
I did not want to be an historian. I spent my school days dreaming of being the next George Best, even though I couldn't kick a ball in a straight line. Or maybe, just maybe, going out with Françoise Hardy one day. I came close to bottom of my class. They put me in the woodwork stream. No Latin for the likes of me. I somehow passed my O-levels, much to my own relief and to the considerable surprise of my teachers. A year later, I was at Sandbach Grammar School. My first class was history. The teacher walked in, his gown swirling through a cloud of chalk dust and tobacco smoke. In 1789, there was a revolution in France. Write it down. This was due to 6 causes, the first of which were the philosophes. There were 4 philosophes: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, and Rousseau. Together, they sapped the morale of the ancien regime and paved the way for revolutionary change. There's a new boy. I was the new boy. He was Pip Semper. I keep telling you, bods, he would say, history is about chaps. And back then, it was. I did not want to be an historian. English literature was my subject. At the same school, another teacher opened up a new world of imaginative possibilities. The world of Shakespeare, Chaucer, the poetry and power of language. His name was Colin Eastwood, or as we called him, Clint. As he took us through the imagery of Othello and Antony and Cleopatra, the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, everything began to change. History was just stuff on a page. This was life. He climbed mountains. He took us to the plays of Sophocles in Stoke-on-Trent. He arranged a school trip to Stratford, where we saw Judi Dench play viola in Twelfth Night. He gave me the role of Henry IV, Part 1 in the school play. I can recite the lines to this day. And so I went to the University of York, the English version. Not to do English, though. You needed Latin for that. I struggled through social sciences until one day a friend told me about a history professor who was giving a lecture on the subject of Welsh-speaking Indians. I'd never encountered anything like it before. A brilliant analysis of the origins and functions of a transatlantic myth, delivered with humor, energy, and passion by a 5-foot-tall Welshman with a speech impediment. It was breathtaking. Gwyn A. Williams. The study of history is difficult and demanding, he once said, and its chief symptom is a permanent dull pain in the head. But when it's done properly, history is like poetry, and he did it properly. I read his books, I took his courses on Marxism, guerrilla war, and the Atlantic Revolution. It was, remember, the early 70s. He introduced me to the transatlantic careers of Thomas Paine and William Cobbett, something well worth further investigation. But not in England. My parents had emigrated to Canada, and I joined them. I applied to McGill, rejected. The University of Toronto, a mimeographed acceptance. Queen's, a personal letter from George A. Rawlick, the graduate chair. Queen's, it was. At York, everything had been about class and revolution. At Queen's, everything was about identity and nationalism. It appeared that everyone in North America, and especially in Canada, was grappling with a collective identity crisis, something that I found rather disquieting. There was another difference. At Queen's, everyone worked much harder than they did at York. When George Rawlick became my supervisor, he jolted me out of my pre-industrial work habits and into a rigorous and disciplined approach to history. He also threw me into the deep end. Suddenly, I was teaching Canadian-American relations, French-Canada, Canadian social history, half a step in front, and more often, half a step behind my students. There was also a strange Irish connection at Queen's. One of the professors had just completed a history of an obscure peninsula in County Antrim, Island Magee, the place where I was born. The professor was Donald Harmon Atkinson. His seminar was a commando course in British and Irish history by a brilliant iconoclast who went on to write 30 books. More than anyone else in academia, he came through for me at key moments in my career. My love of literature runs back to Colin Eastwood at Sandbach School. My work in Atlantic history, Canadian history, Irish history stems from the influence of Gwyn Williams, George Rawlick, and Donald Atkinson. Gwyn Williams died of lung cancer, November the 16th, 1995. George Rawlick died after a car crash a week later. Colin Eastwood is still climbing mountains. Don Atkinson is still writing books. We all need mentors. We all need to be mentors.
Thank you, David. Terrific. Our final speaker is Judith Thompson, professor in the School of English and Theater Studies at the University of Guelph. She is an internationally recognized and produced playwright who has published 15 plays, auteur dramatique et de renommée internationale. Elle fait aussi des mises en scène qui interpellent les jeunes auteurs émergents. She is founded and is the artistic director of the Rare Theater Company a company dedicated to creating barrier-breaking theater pieces with individuals from communities that are seldom heard from and rarely seen on our stage. Professor Thompson will be reading from her literary works this afternoon. Professor Thompson, thank you.
This is a play called Palace of the End, and it's a triptych based on real characters, real people who were involved and around Iraq and the war in Iraq. And the third one is a woman called Nergis al-Safar, and my neighbor who's Iraqi told me all about her. And she was one of the leading figures in the Communist Party. She was killed in the Second Gulf War. She and her husband were one of the only kind of feasible opposition to Saddam Hussein. And she translated from the Arabic an account of what happened to her. I have to skip around, but she was captured by the secret police and her son was tortured to death. And so I'm going to skip around. One of my earliest memories is drawing in my own blood. Drawing a flower, a daffodil, for the school nurse. Looking back, I can't imagine why they were taking the blood of a child at school. It wasn't enough to send to a lab, just enough to draw a daffodil. I drew a daffodil because that is my name, Nerjas, daffodil in Arabic. My Western friends tell me there is no such name in English, although there are many of flower names. There is rose, there is dahlia, there is lily, there is violet, there is viola. I laughed when my British friend said to me, "Now what is the correct spelling of your name, dear? How can you talk of correct spelling when you translate Arabic into English? It is phonetics only." What is fascinating to me is that women are the names of flowers, but not all flowers, because if you are English and you are named Daffodil, people will laugh. That is what my friends have told me. And if they want to insult a man, say to a man he is not masculine, they call him pansy, but not a rose or tulip. And another thing I have observed is that a woman is never called after a tree, only a flower, because the purpose of a flower is to attract a bee. And the tree stands alone, blissfully alone. The tree provides air and shelter and food, so I think all mothers should be given a second name after a tree. Just as the leaves breathe out into the air and fill it with healing substances, I breathe out my memories, good and bad. It is not company I want. It is to bring back what I can never bring back. And anyway, you will know that I deserve to be alone, for I have committed the greatest sin of all. So, back to blood. One of the exhibits at the al-Malik Mosque in central Baghdad was a copy of the Quran written in Saddam Hussein's own blood. This is ironic. This is blasphemic. Why do the heavens not rain frogs and the earth vomit blood at this outrage? The holy book written in the blood of the devil? I wonder who told him to do that, or did he think of it himself? Did a mullah demand of him to do this as a proof of his love for Allah, or did his mother or wife say to him, "You must appease the mullahs, or they will defeat you," because they will defeat you. If they want to defeat you, they are as water, which eventually defeats everything. Is there anything more powerful than the love of God? I want to tell you a secret. Before I had babies, I did not really believe in God. I said that I did. Everyone thought me very religious. I went to the mosque. I prayed 5 times a day. But in my heart, in my secret thoughts, I did not believe. I pretended I did. I never told my secret to anyone, even my husband, because an infidel has no friends. My soul was an empty space until I had my first child, a son. I looked at him and I saw Allah. Skipping. My husband, a leader of the Communist Party, had been in hiding ever since the first coup that the CIA supported. He was the great visionary leader of the Communist Party. So the monsters we lived in fear of were the Ba'ath secret police, Jihaz Hanin, if you can believe it. In English, the instruments of yearning. Can you explain that to me, please? The torture jails were 2 fairy tale castles from long ago when the king had lived. We had not liked him either. He was Saudi, but he was nothing compared to Saddam. The gardens were tended by a master gardener, a true genius of nature. And so the castle was called the Palace of Flowers until the Dark Age, when it became the Palace of the End. So, one day, as I knew they would, they came for us. Thank God they let my mother take Laila, but they took Nahadni, my 15-year-old, from school, and me from my home. I had been boiling an egg to have with the date. It's true. And then in came the thugs. And you know who they were? You might wonder, who were these secret police? How did they collect so many eager criminals and sadists? Well, I tell you, they were the local bullies. Some of them I recognized. They used to bother me when my brother and I went to the movies. They would harass me, say filthy things, and my brother gave them a warning. That's who it was. The losers, the ones who would torture animals, the people you avoid. So they took us to the prison. I remember thinking, thank God they do not have Fadil, my 8-year-old boy. He will know when he comes to an empty house, he will know to go to the neighbors. He had been carrying some mail from house to house. Young boys would do that for us. They were so fast and small. So we are driving up to the castle, like an American horror movie. Now, the castle has 3 stories. The highest floor is where they would take you to talk. The surroundings were quite nice, a reasonable conversation, and if you were willing to talk, you betrayed everyone you knew, as most people did, you were free to go. Sadly, many were afraid of torture, so they talked immediately. I don't judge anyone. Everyone is different. Torture changes everything. Then, if you didn't wish to talk, they would send you down to the main floor. It was what we called torture light. Beatings, broken bones, nails removed, that kind of thing. And if you still didn't talk, you were sent to the basement. There were bodies everywhere, bodies of people we knew. Once you have smelled the smell of death, nothing smells sweet again, not ever again. So, at first we were sent to the highest floor, and we refused to speak. Then we were sent to the first floor, a small room. Me, my 15-year-old son, and my torturers. The first thing they did, they held my belly in their hands. They laughed. They said, "Who did this to you?" I turned to my son. I said, "Don't listen to them. They are half men." They said to me, "Where is your husband?" I said that I did not know. They started only by jumping on my feet and hitting my son's nose with a hammer. They hit him until he could not feel it. So I stopped crying out, and then they stopped hitting him. We were inside hell now. Needless to say, I was raped many times in front of my son. They forced him to watch, but he did not see. His eyes looked into my eyes only. So wise for 15. And so I'll skip ahead. They got their little son, and so they let me embrace him once. First, they asked him to tell them where was his father. He said he didn't know. He had been well trained. And then they began to beat me again and rape me again to scare him into speaking, to protect his mother. But he knew. I turned my face to him to make sure he was alive, and you know what he did? He smiled at me. He kept smiling to give me courage. He was 8 years old. So I'm going to skip the torture. He dies, the son dies. They came in laughing. "We found your son anyway, you foolish woman. And oh, we are sorry about him, but we were going to let him go today, but he must have had a weak constitution. He is with Allah, the palace of the end." So, you might be wondering, does she still believe in Allah? If she found Allah in the face of her son, where is he now? Where are her rivers of faith? Of course, my faith was gone. The riverbeds were dry, but my soul was not empty, and I will tell you why. Many nights I had a dream that when I would finally die, which happened in the first Gulf War when I was killed right here by an American bomb, I would finally again see my son. And I knew that he would smile to me just as he did on that darkest day, a smile that said, Forgive. Forgive yourself, Mummy, because I forgave you. And he takes my hand, and together we fly. We fly around Baghdad, putting the crowns back on all the date palm trees. And this is what happened. It's very nice, this flying, just the same as in your dreams, only better. So we flew for a while. And after a while, he said, Mummy, you must go back to Baghdad. Watch over our people with all the other ghosts. Me, I am a child. I can go to paradise now. But you must watch, because the worst, Mummy, the worst is yet to come. You must watch until finally there is peace. But I will wait for you. And so I am here, watching, with the thousands of other ghosts who are watching with me. Do you see them? There are more every day. They are everywhere, all around us. And when there is finally peace, Fadil will come again, and we will fly together. We will fly through the white clouds and into the eyes of Allah. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. That was a compelling and powerful conclusion to an enthralling afternoon. So could you all join me in thanking our speakers for their fascinating, compelling, and in many ways creative and unique presentations? I would also like to thank once again the University of Victoria for their generous support, which made this event possible. I hope you enjoyed this afternoon's presentations. They were terrific and moving, and I must say that it was a wonderful way to spend a lunch at the Royal Society. Thank you all for coming.